Welcome back to the Food Forest, everybody. Today we're going to talk about watering. How often do you have to water your plants? How often do you have to water your food forest based on the age of the plants? All that kind of stuff. Factors that go into how often you should water. We'll talk about some of the reasons why people think this is a big deal and you need some kind of prescriptive schedule, and it doesn't really work like that in a permaculture setup. Let's talk about it. And let's talk about this, watering lawns. Why do we do this? It's stupid. Okay, a question I get all the time is how often should I water my plants? And I can see where that comes from because in most garden setups, we just throw plants in dirt. The water that we do put on evaporates away very quickly. And because of that, we have to constantly, really closely monitor that situation and reapply water very often to keep all the plants going. And that's just the way that most people garden. In a permaculture setup, because we plant so densely and we have so much shade and so much mulch, it's impossible to answer that question. It's impossible to create a regiment of how often you need to water your plants. Instead, in a permaculture setup, we do it completely the opposite way. We actually ask the plants, how often do you want water? How often do you need to be watered? We listen to what the plants are telling us, and then we react to that. For a dense 3D polyculture, permaculture, food forest style garden, the answer to how often do I have to water is go look and see if you need it. So we look at the plants and we look for signs of underwatering, and then we go down and we pull back the mulch and we look at what is happening at the soil level. This is the only way that you can possibly know if your plants actually need water. If you actually just go out and water at a regular interval and you have a deep mulch, you have really nice shading on the soil level, you could very well be overwatering your plants and they could be drowning. And drowning plants can get no oxygen down to the roots and they experience chlorosis. They actually can't perform photosynthesis if they have too much water around their roots and not enough oxygen around their roots. Remember that plants need carbon dioxide from the air in order to perform photosynthesis, but they also need oxygen. The plant's roots actually perform respiration and they will need oxygen in order to allow the plant to perform photosynthesis. Okay, now in the last 2 weeks, it's probably only rained for about 1 hour and it was a very little bit amount of rain. And you can see in the areas that we don't mulch, such as a lawn, the lawn is very, very dry. You can actually hear it when I walk. And even though we cut our lawn on the max blade height, you'll notice that there's just no mulch down there. And when I feel down there, let me see if I can dig up a little bit of dirt. It's just dry. It's bone dry. And this is even in a spot where our septic will kind of let out and provide a little bit of extra moisture. This here is the grass I was just walking on in the middle of my lawn. And you can see the soil is literally just bone dry, and there's nothing to it. And all that soil life just goes running. And when the soils get dry like this, they actually become hydrophobic. And it takes a little bit of water infiltration to sit and wet and moisten that soil back up before it'll even hold water. So even if we get a rainfall, it will all hit this and it'll just sheet across the land, even if there's only a very slight grade on the land. Okay, so now let's check where we deep mulch the ground. This is actually part of the new annual beds for tomatoes we're growing up here and some zucchini. And we deep mulch this area with wood chips. So let's actually pull the wood chips back and see what the soil is like at ground level. This is the do I need to water my plants or not question. Okay, so what we want to do is actually look at what the plant is telling us. In this case, this new tomato plant is actually telling me that in fact it does need water, which is really no surprise. We haven't gotten any water, and these just got transplanted out. These have had to go basically 2 weeks with no water at all. And what you're starting to see is some curling up of the leaves. See how they're folding in on themselves? And what they're trying to do is they're trying to prevent evapotranspiration. They're trying to prevent water loss out of the leaf to the atmosphere. And curling up is a good way to do that. Okay, so now pulling back a bit, we'll look at what's actually happening at the soil level. And it is so much more moist down here. So these are the conditions that the tomato is seeing. So imagine these tomatoes grown in a bare soil garden. They would all be dead, every single one of them. I haven't watered these in 2 weeks after transplanting them. This is probably instant death for most things, but because we have the thick wood chips, any water that was in this soil is being retained. So what's most important to do is look at the plant health, and then dig back and actually look at what the soil condition is. It's very dry still here, but then as we get lower, it's actually getting quite moist. It's much different than the lawn, and much different than what you would think of if you just looked at the top layer of wood chips. Dry, pretty moist. Those wood chips like a giant sponge, so if I can soak and fill that sponge so it's holding as much water as possible, then the plants don't go through this wet-dry cycle like a sawtooth curve, where we water them, it gets really wet, and then we don't water for a day and it gets really dry because we have no mulch, and then wet and dry and wet and dry. And we're watering every day, but it's drying out every day. That's really bad for the roots. They don't like wet, dry, wet, dry. The deep mulch instead will cause almost like a charge curve. So you'll soak it up, and then it'll slowly discharge over the course of a week or 2 weeks or even 3-4 weeks, depending on the moisture content, the shading that you have at the soil level, the amount of wood chips, the type of wood chips. There's so many factors that happen, the amount of wind wicking moisture away. There's so many factors in a deep mulch method that it's impossible to give somebody a regimented guide. You really have to get out there and look at what the soil and the plants are telling you to do. Okay, so let's talk about some factors that impact how often you'll have to water, and things that you can do to minimize the amount of watering that you're going to have to do in your garden. So the first factor is going to be how deep, how big, how thick is your sponge. And this is the above ground sponge, but also the below ground sponge. So how thick is your wood chip layer? Do you have just a couple inches, or do you have a nice even 6-inch deep layer of wood chips? How much water when it rains is actually going to get soaked up? That's really, really an important factor in determining how often you're going to have to water. So thickness of your mulch is a really big factor. Now, type of mulch is going to be another big factor. Whether you have straw, hay, or wood chips, each material is going to absorb different amounts of water. It'll soak and hold different amounts. Biochar, for example, soaks and holds a tremendous amount of water. So getting biochar inoculated into your soils and even into your mulch layer can be a tremendous benefit for storing and holding water. How much shade is reaching your soil level? This is really important for lowering the temperature at the ground level. And additionally, because the shade usually comes from plants, that also typically means that it's deflecting the wind around the soil at the ground level. So winds aren't racing across the ground level, wicking moisture away with it. They're being deflected around this kale plant, for example. And you can see in general, look at the health of the strawberries where the soil is a little shaded compared to over here where it's a little bit sunnier. In this area here, these strawberries look like they're not quite as happy as, for example, these strawberries here. These ones are just likely getting a little bit more water due to the windbreak and the shade of the kale. So this is why it can be really beneficial. Instead of when something's done growing, if it's not completely blocking sun out to the new plants actually don't mind that dappled shade. So if you can leave stuff like kale going to flower, it's great for the pollinators, but then it also provides dappled shade to the new nursery plants that you just put in, all your brand new zucchini and squash and tomatoes and peppers. They'll actually kind of like this dappled shade from the kale. It'll help just keep a little bit more moisture in the ground. And then look, you get the added benefit of feeding bees. Next two factors I'll clump in together because they tend to kind of run together. In fact, all of the factors tend to run together. The next one is going to be plant density. So the denser you can put your plants, the more shading that there's going to be in the soil, the more windbreak you're going to have, and it's just overall healthier for the ecosystem of your garden soil because you're collecting more photosynthesis. In addition, planting perennials in your garden, even intermixing them with spaces where you do your annuals, that puts roots in the ground that right away, as soon as the season starts, the soil food web of life is getting fed. So people who just have a cleared out bed and they only put annuals in it, if you think of yourself as a soil microbiology, a little bacteria or fungus who needs those plant root exudates in order to survive, because that's what we eat. If we just clear our beds out at the end of the year, that stuff has no food, so the population crashes. And then when everything starts up, we put in these tiny little baby plants everywhere, and they don't really have a ton of photosynthesis going on. If instead we intermix some annuals with some perennials, then as soon as the season kicks off, look at all the root exudates that are going into the soil right now from this raspberry patch. And yes, maybe mixing raspberries with annuals isn't the best idea. This was going to be a raspberry patch. We since moved into annuals just because the raspberries spread. Gives us opportunities to dig them out and make a little side money, which we're definitely not making any side money, and we definitely owe no taxes on that side money that we're not making. But if you were to imagine someone would do that, that's a way that you could do that. But just the very act of having perennials in the system means that the soil life is getting fed right away, and they're getting those sugars right away, and the density is there to shade the soil right away. And then you can plant on the edges of your perennials. It doesn't have to be something that spreads like raspberries. It could just be even a biennial like kale that acts as that early photosynthesis, the early dappled shading to the soil level. So density, and also including variety of plants and variety of types, annuals and perennials, could be a really good way to maximize that water retention inside your gardens. So what if we combine permaculture principles such as using deep tap-rooted nutrient accumulators like comfrey as a soil builder, and we can chop it and drop it and feed it into our soil food web of life to remove the sun competition for, say, a new tomato or a new bean or a new pepper plant that we plant. This is the perennial that'll get up and going really early, feed that soil life, put all that energy into the leaves, and then we come and we chop the leaves off and we drop them down onto the soil to help mulch the soil, keep the sun off the soil, keep the temperatures low, keep that soil microbiology protected. And these have water inside of them, and as it decomposes, it'll release that water back. Look at the water inside of this plant. It will actually release that back into the soils. So in this way, we're kind of combining all of these principles together. Now, one little caution with comfrey is I wouldn't plant comfrey as a companion to, say, a potato patch where you're going to be jamming a shovel in and digging and severing the roots, because what you'll do is you'll spread your comfrey throughout your whole garden. But if you put comfrey in a way that you're not necessarily disturbing the soil when you plant, maybe you could plant next to it, and instead of digging down to put your tomatoes in, you could add a layer of compost and plant into the compost layer. And in this way, you're never disturbing the soil, you're never disturbing the comfrey roots to propagate it, but you're using the comfrey as a chop and drop soil builder and a shade and a windbreak and early food for the soil web of life to help with your annual garden as well. Mixing those perennials in with the annuals. It's a very good idea and something that people should think about doing. Another really important factor is like, what's the actual plant we're talking about? Are we talking about a tree? Are we talking about a cactus? Are we talking about a watermelon? You know, vastly different water requirements, and even per plant depending on what it's doing. Is it just growing leaves, or is it putting fruit on? Is it putting a watermelon on? So different plants are going to have vastly different water requirements, and even throughout the stages of their life. So if your garden is all lettuces and kales and leafy greens, you might have a different requirement to water those than if you're mostly working with bushes and trees and perennials that are already established. Just on that last part, how old is the plant? Is it a 5-year-old plant? Is it a 10-year-old plant? Is it a 2-week-old plant? The smaller the root system, the roots are going to be mostly in the top soil layer and mostly just in and around the plant. So you're not going to really need to actually deep water the entire soil. You're going to have to kind of spot feed each plant. And if you put drip tape down and the drip tape's a little too far away from a baby plant, you know, that baby plant might actually be in desert conditions, whereas another plant right near the drip hole of that drip tape might be in like flood wetland conditions. So this is just another way where we can create really extreme climates just based on the ways that we run things and set things up. One other thing to consider is that we're not just watering our plants. Our plants do need water, but so does everything that the plants depend on. The plants put those root exudates down into the soil to feed the soil life. That soil life needs water as well. So make sure you're planting densely, make sure you're planting with diversity, but also make sure that you're watering in a way that you're feeding the entire soil. You're not just feeding an individual plant, because your entire soil food web of life does need water. Now, if water is a concern for you, if water is a financial thing, then sure, try to go easy on it, but that's all the more reason to mulch thickly, shade more, plant densely, to conserve that water and any water that does fall. We're not just watering our plants, we're watering the soil. So how often do you have to water your grass? Pretty much every single day, because there's no mulch, there's no shade, there's no diversity, there's no windbreak, there's no nothing. It's just getting absolutely devastated in terms of the water's just wicking away, it's evaporating away, and there's no soil retention for the water. You got to water your grass constantly. Lawns are terrible things. I have to water this lawn or it's going to die, and that makes my wife unhappy because it makes our house look bad. I'd like to replace this whole thing with food florists, and I've definitely had that conversation. I've been allowed to expand it quite a bit, so I'm happy with that for now. And the only way to really know if you need to water is to go outside and look. Listen to the plants, listen to the soil. They'll tell you if you need to water or not. So thanks for watching. I hope this answers some of your how often do I need to water. And remember, when we follow the rules of nature and we do things the way nature does, we take a lot of work away that the human would have to do. Watering is just one of those things. And if you have any other interest in doing earthworks to even take this to the next level, make sure you check out my swale videos. I have a whole host on swales. I have a complete comprehensive swale guide. I have a grass to swale transformation. I talk about my swales all the time. These are ways that we can capture and hold and store even more water, but instead of holding it in mulch and organic matter in the topsoil, we hold it deep in the subsoils and we recharge that ground aquifer. They're fantastic. So if you're starting a project fresh, consider putting in a swale. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next video.